Podcasters Roundtable, round 79, podcasting outside of the U.S. or United States. It's not my favorite title. I was like, what should I call this? But it makes sense, I guess, from the perspective of Podcasters Roundtable, a show where all the regular hosts, myself, Daniel, Dave, we're all based here in the United States. So I wanted to invite some podcasters who are not in the U.S. or maybe their primary audience or their primary listener is not based in the U.S. Or do we even focus on that? That's something we want to talk about. And just to find out if there's any differences between producing a podcast in other countries. Because, again, I only have the perspective of the U.S., which, you know, gets, I think, the majority of the attention. And I will fix the website here, Daniel, in a sec. That means, Daniel, you're going to get the first question to ask, and I will go work on the website. It should be working. Hopefully everyone's seeing it live. Anyways. So let's meet the round table. Because like I said, I think we hear most about podcasts in the U.S., and we're a global medium. So let's see if there's any other considerations and see if anyone else on our panel who I don't think anyone is in the U.S., although Orlando's maybe. We'll see what's going on there because he is, but he isn't. So right on the very end, before he loses power to a hurricane, Alan, welcome to the round table.
Yeah, I'm Alan Nipper, and my main focus right now in the world of what this show is about is Capicua FM, and I am based in Coral Gables, Florida, although about 55% of our listeners are outside of the United States, and the show is not in English, although recently we had a pretty important invitee who only speaks English, but he had his spokesperson with him, and he's a presidential candidate. But most of in fact, all of the other interviewees we've ever had have been in Castilian, commonly known as Spanish, and we cover different issues. And I also write for Pro Video Coalition, so some people know me from Pro Video Coalition magazine. In fact, I think you and I have exchanged some things regarding some video issues on Pro Video Coalition magazine.
Yeah, some fun news today, but we won't dive into that. So, Sony releasing some fun camera goodies today. What is going on in your microphone? There's a lot of pads. I have to ask about that because, you know, gear junkies.
Oh, I wish I could remember the name of it, but it's a whacked out windscreen because I'm going back temporarily to the AT2005 USB, which is inside of it, although it looks like it's much bigger right now.
Cool.
Because I've made the sad decision to sell the BP40, so I put the BP40 up for sale. So I'm using this in the meantime.
Right. So if you're just listening,
I see that Daniel is smiling. I guess it's because of the comment that I said about the BP40.
Yeah. If you're just listening to this and you're not seeing it, he's got a lot of foam wrapped around the mic. We can't see. It's a corn dog
I didn't make
microphone.
it. It's actually
you can't tell what's inside.
Product, but I can't remember the name of it now.
That's all right. You could make that at home, I think. You could just wrap some foam.
Somebody could, but I bought it made already. I think it was from Markertech. But I think Daniel is laughing, I think, because of the comment that I made about the BP40, or maybe it's something to do with something completely different from that. I'm not sure.
I was just thinking of everything that could be done with the BP40 because that thing is like a solid pice of metal.
Yeah.
I remember.
Okay, my fault. My fault. I've derailed with gear. This is so easy to do. I have to just stop the madness.
We're podcasters.
It's my fault. I know exactly, and it's my fault. I'm the king gear junkie. Daniel, welcome back. Co-host Daniel, welcome back.
Thank you very much. I will stall for time while Ray tries to figure something out going on in the back end.
So you can introduce the rest of the roundtable. I'm going to refresh the cache here.
Sure. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from the Audacity to Podcast. I am born, raised American. Actually, interesting trivia thing here. I'm actually half Slavic, even though I'm born in America, but my dad is technically full-blooded Slavic, even though he was born in America too. His parents were immigrants. Nonetheless, it's really cool to connect with an international audience, especially after having International Podcast Day just recently. It's September 30th every year, internationalpodcastday.com. Dave, over to you.
I'm Dave Jackson from the School of Podcasting.com. I'm an official American mutt. I am part Cherokee Indian, part Creek Indian, part Irish, part German, and who knows what else. That's why you have a weird guy who used to have black hair and freckles. It just doesn't work that way. But yeah, looking forward to this. I've always said podcasting is a global, phenomenon, and it's cool that I can be in Akron, Ohio, and be listened to by somebody on the other side of the planet. And with that, I'll tag it over to Robert.
Hi there, guys. This is Rob Burriss. My podcast is called the Psychology of Attractiveness podcast. I'm a psychologist here at Basel University in Switzerland. And my day job is researching people's romantic relationships, jealousy, infidelity, love, and this sort of thing. And so I talk about new research on my podcast, which I started recording when I lived in the States. I moved back to the UK, and now I'm here in Switzerland.
Nice.
Very cool. And rounding it out, Orlando, welcome to the Roundtable.
Thank you very much. My name is Orlando Mergal, and I run the Hablando de Tecnología podcast. In English, that would be Talking Tech with Orlando Mergal. We talk about technology with a broad stroke. It's not about computers and telephones. We talk about anything with a chip in it, sort of like Leo Laporte. I've had people on my program talking about renewable energy, clean water, usability, different subjects. All the common thread is that it has to do with technology, and I'm out of Puerto Rico. I was born in the States. Both my parents are Puerto Ricans. They left for the States during the 50s as part of a generation that was called Los Tomateros, the tomato pickers. My parents were not tomato pickers. My mother was a teacher. She was a teacher. She's still alive. My father died, and he used to be a supervisor in one of the buildings in Manhattan. So I came back to the island when I was 9. I was lucky enough to conserve my English because I hung out with a crew that was all what we call New Yorkers in Puerto Rico. I had a rock and roll band. I was the singer. So I was fortunate to keep my English, and I have friends that came back more or less at the time that I came back who don't speak a word of English.
Cool. So I dug into the stats a little bit for this show, and I am only looking here at the YouTube stats, and I think Daniel and Dave might have some of their audio podcast stats. But looking at the YouTube, that's what we're doing right now, live on YouTube, podcastersroundtable.com/guest. Sign up so you can join us. The United Kingdom, so outside the U.S., United Kingdom comes in second for, watch time as far as YouTube goes. But, I mean, it's strong. It's 81% of the viewers are coming from the United States. Now, there's no real reason for that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know why it would be. I actually don't know why. It's not like we market it to the U.S., right? This is on YouTube. In theory, anyone could watch, anyone could find out. So I'm curious why it's so skewed that way. Is it something I'm doing? Are we not welcoming an international audience? You know, one of the cool things about Roundtable is I think almost at least every other round, it feels like we have someone who is like up in the middle of the night helping us like be a co-host on the Roundtable, like from Thailand or something crazy. So definitely international as far as guests are concerned. But, you know, I want to ask you guys, so I guess, Robert, do you know what the primary audience is for your podcast? Are you getting most people coming from the US, or do you know?
Yeah, from the stats that I've got, and, you know, we don't know how reliable these are, I guess, right. But the stats that I've got suggest that about 45% of my audience is coming from the US. And as you say, the UK is coming around second, maybe around 8% of my audience from there, then Canada. And after that, it sort of, you know, drops off. But so, yeah, again, most of the audience, or at least a sizable proportion of the audience, coming from the States.
Now, do you market it towards any one particular market, or is it just kind of open like the way podcasting is? You just put it out there. You're not necessarily catering. Now, it's English, right? So exactly, that has something to do with it.
I mean, I'm sure a lot of it's got to be down to the population thing. There's just more people in the States. And maybe, I don't know, but maybe a greater proportion of people have a decent internet connection. I know when I lived in the States a few years ago, I was super surprised that the internet connection was so great compared to what it was in the UK. So I don't know, maybe just there's that sort of bandwidth thing going on for a lot of people. But yeah, I don't really promote the podcast other than to, I guess, my network of fellow researchers, most of whom do work in the States though. So yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe it is just, I'm not different to any other podcast. It just seems to be half the audience is coming from the US.
Daniel, what's the difference there where he's in Switzerland, right, Robert?
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
And he's primarily in the Switzerland iTunes store, right? I mean, he can be found in the U.S. iTunes store, but he's more likely to rank better in Switzerland, right? I mean,
Right. Every
theoretically?
iTunes store has its own collection of all the R's, ratings, rankings, and reviews, and related podcasts as well. So it's basically like a completely different store if you switch countries in iTunes. But when you're in iTunes, you are in all 155 different iTunes stores.
Is your rank at all affected by the fact that you've submitted via another country? You know what I mean? Like, do they preference over in your own country? Do you think it ranks differently? It must
I
rank
don't
differently.
think so.
It's still all about subscribers, right? If your
Well, I mean,
subscribers are dominating, what's that, Robert?
I was going to say, I mean, I submitted the podcast in the US store. I lived in the US when I started the podcast in 2009. And I used to occasionally check what the ranking was in the UK. You know, I'm British, so I was interested in what the British audience was. And the podcast would tend to rank more highly, I think, in the British store than the US store. I haven't really checked in the last few years, so I'm not sure if anything's changed there in the meantime.
Orlando, your primary audience, is it? Where do you see most people coming from, or do you look at that?
Yes, absolutely. I look at that. Until a couple of months ago, it used to be Colombia, the main country where I had most of my listeners. Now it's the United States, Colombia second, Mexico third, Spain fourth, the Dominican Republic fifth, and Puerto Rico sixth. We have a saying in Puerto Rico that you're not a prophet in your own land, no eres profeta en tu propia tierra, and it seems to be what's happening with me. One thing that many people don't know is that the United States has 41 million people that speak Spanish. It has more Spanish-speaking people than Spain. So I have my main audience in the United States, and I know for a fact that most of them have to be the Latino community because most Americans don't study Spanish in school.
Well, I studied it, and my last name is Spanish, but I don't speak it, so I'm very sad about that. But it's unfortunate. But I mean, that may come back to the population thing. And Robert mentioned, I mean, at this point, there's more Spanish speakers here that you're saying than there is in Spain, right? And
yes, I have the data. I looked it up with a website that's called Ethnologue, and the country with the most Spanish-speaking people is Mexico, Colombia second, United States third, Argentina fourth, and Spain fifth.
So I mean, it sounds like it's kind of following along with your stats almost, right?
More or less. There's a slight difference, but more or less, yes, I am in most of the places where people speak Spanish. Yeah. This is the first time actually that the second time I was on a podcast from Australia, but this is the second time that I've been on a podcast that's in English. I've been on other podcasts, but they have been in Spanish.
Yeah, and Alan, how about you? Is there? I mean, it's Spanish language podcast as well, right? Oh, did we lose Alan? I hope the hurricane didn't take him out. He's frozen. It's all right. Dave, when we're putting together a podcast, I mean, you're not targeting the U.S. audience, are you? Or are you trying? Are you trying? Is there customers that you need to get that are U.S.? Oh,
and he's back.
It's really because
sort of,
everyone in my books.
I tried to mute
the countries.
All right, Alan, you're not coming through. It's not letting me mute him too. All right, he's breaking right through the mute there. Alan, just decrease your bandwidth in the settings up top, and we'll try to get you through. Dave.
But yeah, I usually just talk like whoever I'm thinking about. That one listener is sitting across the table from me. And I would assume my Americanness would just kind of drip through. So when I start talking about, Columbus Day is next Monday, or something that's holiday related that may not be celebrated in other places of the globe, I don't think about that. And sometimes I think maybe I should, or if I talk about going to Target or, you kind of assume Walmart is everywhere because they're like on every corner here in the U.S., but I have no idea what it's like.
I've heard podcasters integrate. They'll say, "Hey, if you celebrate, right? Like, if it's something that's here but not another country, right?" So, I mean, at some level, we are kind of aware that we are a global medium, and we're speaking to people who could be anywhere. So, do you take any other considerations when you're producing your show into the fact that you may be speaking to a lot of people you are speaking to a lot of people who aren't in the U.S.?
I actually don't. I think I'm more of the, shoot first, ask for forgiveness later. So I find out later that, hey, you shouldn't have said this or that, or people might take it this way, or because I'm just talking like my best friend is sitting across the table, and maybe I should think about that a little more than I do. But so far, I haven't had a whole lot of feedback from people going, hey, you don't realize that you did this or you did that, or people in this country don't think that. And I know in different cultures, I always wonder how we come across, because I know Todd talks about his wife, who is, I want to say Filipino?
Japanese.
Japanese, that talking about yourself is like just unheard of. So when we are out saying anything that slightly toots our own horn, I realize in other parts of the world, people are probably like, oh, there goes the cocky American again. So I always wonder how that comes across.
Well, Orlando, what are the perceptions of, what's a perception of podcasting in the U.S. versus maybe what it's like producing a show outside?
Well, as far as producing it, it's more or less the same thing. The culture tends to be a little different in South America, where I have most of my listeners. And there's a fact that we have 20 Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America, and every one of them speaks more or less their own brand of Spanish. It's not, if you listen to an Argentinian and you listen to somebody from Colombia, they're both speaking Spanish, but they have a lot of regional words that aren't used in a different country. So I'm very mindful of that. Yeah. And what I do is that sometimes when I use words that I know that are regional from Puerto Rico, I always tell people what it is, because I know that halfway across the world, somebody's listening to me who won't have a clue of what I'm saying,
Yeah. And I think as podcasters, we sort of do that in terms of even just with jargon, right? So if we're saying something in English and we know our audience maybe is not familiar even with that piece of gear, right? I think we have to have that mind, that a lot of us have to think, ooh, maybe they don't understand. Like in this case, we're on video, and I was talking about Alan's microphone, and I was, made sure to say, hey, if you are listening audio only. So, always having an audience who is different. I mean, this medium, again, it's global. You can be video, you can be audio only. There's a lot of different types of consumption going on from different types of people. So you'd have to think about that. Robert, do those considerations come into you're an English-speaking podcast, but do you have to make some of those considerations?
Yeah, I definitely do. That was, I think, a really relevant point for me there that Orlando brought up. And I wouldn't have realized that, I don't think, if I hadn't had those couple of years living in the States where, you come from the UK and you think, hey, these people in the US, they speak my language, so they should be able to understand all my slang. But of course, we get a lot more of the US TV in the UK than I think you get UK media in the US. So I might be using British slang and assuming people in the US will understand, but maybe not. I remember the first time I used the word fortnight in Pennsylvania, and they all thought I was from some Charles Dickens novel or something.
By the way, I love Fortnite, and I use it as often as I can on this show because we are a fortnightly based show. But
yeah. But it's one of those words that you don't even realize that Americans, maybe a large proportion, I don't know, don't use, or maybe don't know what it means. And so, yeah, definitely I do try to, when I'm writing the script for my podcast and I'm thinking about what I'm going to say, I try to cut down on some of the British slang, or maybe I leave some of the British slang in that I feel like people are going to understand, because maybe some listeners are listening in just because they want to hear some British guy talk weird. That's okay.
Well, I mean, in line with that, at some level, podcasting, you're often talking to a niche audience, and part of that community, sometimes it can feel more special, that like we get it and no one else does. Like I think there's an element to that. Now, I think on a show like this, we want to be, we're niche, but we're broad to that niche. Whereas you may have a comedy show where it's like, or even your own show where there's might be very specific terms that people are happy that maybe only they get, almost like an inside joke. In podcasts, actually, they talk about podcasts being intimate, and this is one of those things, inside jokes. I talk about getting a shirt, and if you listen to the Podcasters Roundtable, you know what it means to maybe get a Podcasters Roundtable t-shirt. So So I think that's part of community. So I think it's an interesting aspect to think about blending, how much you do of that and how much you want to be inclusive of anyone who's listening.
Yeah, I think if we try to be everything to everybody and we all have to talk a certain way, that's just not going to work. The guy on the pub was talking about when people try to be somewhat outrageous or edgy, part of that is talking a certain way. And when you are somewhat, your community talks a certain way because that's the way they talk. And that's, if there's a certain way to do that, it's going to rub some people the wrong way because I don't understand what you mean when you say I hit a stag and it flew, that he hit a deer and it went up on his hood. I'm like, okay. But on the other hand, everybody in the UK can go, oh, I know what he's talking about. And that's exactly what you're talking about, Ray. It's the community that goes, yeah, he talks like I do. And I often wonder sometimes if, does an American accent, after a while, oh, I cannot handle this guy going, water. It's Walter. So if after a while it gets on your nerves.
But you have excuse me?
Go ahead.
You have differences in the states, within the states themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Because, for example, I've heard you say interesting.
Yeah.
I was brought up in New York. I learned to say interesting.
Yeah.
That, for example. And I'm sure that if you go down to New Orleans, they probably say it some other way that's not the way you say it or I do.
Yeah.
So across the states, you do have differences, too.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's the same in the UK. I know there are different parts of the UK with different accents, even though they're all speaking the same language.
I try to watch out
Dan.
for those things that those sayings or those phrases, and it's usually after I say them that I'll kind of catch it and realize that may not make sense outside of the United States, let alone a country where someone doesn't speak English as their native language. And it's common things like maybe home run or the next level or anything like that can be confusing maybe to someone, these certain metaphors and such. And so if I say them, and I think this comes from my background of teaching kids for years, but if I say something and suddenly realize that doesn't make too much sense to this audience, then I'll just rephrase it, add extra words just to be extra in my communication.
Robert, you were going to chime in with something?
Yeah, I was going to say, you were talking about accents in the UK. I mean, here in Switzerland, people are so surprised that my accent, I'm from near Liverpool, is different to the accent in Manchester, which is just, I think, 50 or 60 miles down the road. And I definitely think the differences in the accent in the UK and how they're perceived, because they're tied up so much with social class, is one of the reasons why I was reluctant at first to start my podcast, because the Liverpool accent is perceived within the UK quite negatively. We're seen as, I don't know, it's like thieves. The stereotype of the person from Liverpool is that they're a thief or something, and it's not seen as a particularly likable accent. So it's definitely not the sort of accent you hear on radio all the time. But when I was in the States, people there were saying, oh, I like your accent. It was so nice, so polite to say this. I thought that they're just being nice to me. It's not true. But then I started to realize that really it's not a problem for the audience that I'm likely to get for this podcast. It's probably going to be a majority American audience, and probably most Americans aren't going to be the type of people who hear my accent and have some idea about what that says about my character, whether it's true or not.
Yeah, Adam in the chat room has the same response I did. He says, Liverpool equals the Beatles. I'm like, what do you mean? Everyone loves you guys.
To everyone, of course.
You're all related to the Beatles, right?
Yeah, I mean, okay, maybe my best mate served Paul McCartney in the supermarket, okay? But
exactly.
Yeah, outside the UK, it means the Beatles. Inside the UK, not so much. Not so much, yeah.
Nice. So, Daniel, you deal a lot with...
Am I still muted?
Yeah, nope, you're
Back.
live.
Okay, well, in my program in Capicua FM, actually one of the things that we cover are the regional expressions throughout the Castilian-speaking world in Latin America and Spain and other places. So we cover those things, and sometimes we even have anecdotes about misunderstandings that have come up either between me and someone else or one of my guests or co-hosts. So it's an important thing, as you've been saying, and I've been able to catch as I got my internet connection back again.
By the way, what's your Capicu podcast about? It's not about dominoes.
It's about the language, about the culture, among the interviews that we've had have been seniors throughout, journalists, things like that. So it's all about the language and the culture and how it's used in different countries. That's what it's about.
Okay.
Alan's battling the elements there. Alan,
And
where are
recently,
you located?
We had
Latency's killing us.
Can you hear me?
I'm gonna have to mute.
I'm in Coral Gables, Miami, Florida.
Yeah, it sounds like it's getting rough there. I'm gonna assume it's not the hurricane. It's just bad internet.
Close by.
Yeah, it's running right through. Daniel, with my podcast reviews and getting your international reviews, these are different. We talk about the different stores that exist for iTunes, and it was like 126. I mean, how many different?
155 different iTunes
155
stores.
different iTunes stores. So you can go on iTunes and see. You're probably getting a lot of reviews you don't know exist because you're getting them in other countries. What do what do you see when it comes to the differences between podcasting outside the U.S.?
Well, I see that those podcasts that are intended to be international, like language podcasts especially, get a extremely broad global audience. And for International Podcast Day this year, in the Gratitude Award, the way that we worked it out is the podcast with the most engaged global audience would win the award. And that went to Español Automático podcast. And they had a very global audience, not a very big audience, but a very broad audience. And I see that also with Coffee Break.
When you say broad, what do you mean?
Well, a global, like across more countries. So, most podcasters, the way I see it in my podcast reviews, looking at all 100,000 plus reviews we've tracked now, most of the reviews are US, UK, and Canada. Australia's in there a little bit, but it is mostly English-speaking countries. But then those language podcasts, the spread is really broad. It's not heavily one particular country or another like it is for most of the English shows.
So what do you think was the key to having like much smaller numbers but a lot more reviews internationally for that show?
Well, something like language can appeal to someone.
You're talking about a how-to language podcast, right?
Right, yeah, or just something that teaches culture in some way. It's understandable that anyone in the world could want that thing that is very international in focus. Whereas I think a lot of the podcasts that we create, especially here in the United States, do lean very much toward a United States lifestyle and United States thinking. And so that's why the U.S. will usually result in the most downloads, besides the fact that
why do you think it converted to more reviews, though?
For the international podcast, you're saying?
Yeah, the winner of that got more reviews with a smaller audience. You know what I mean? They had a more engaged audience if you're going to measure engagement by reviews.
It was an algorithm. So it wasn't a raw number of reviews. The reviews that they had were more spread out. And this is something that we designed the algorithm so that it would give every podcast an equal playing field. So it's not the popular podcast is going to win. It wasn't a numbers game. It was an engagement, global breadth engagement issue. So, for example, one of the other podcasts that was close to the top had 400 something reviews, but most of them, like 300 of them or so, were from the United States. Whereas this podcast that won had far fewer reviews, but they were all very spread out, even in more countries, but far fewer total number.
Robert and Orlando and any of you guys, do you guys experience, what's your engagement like between people inside the U.S. and outside? Do you get more engagement from one or the other? Do you have a hard time getting engagement like the rest of us do? But how does that work? Robert, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I guess I don't really invite a huge amount of interaction with my audience, but occasionally I'll get an email from a psychology student who's heard the podcast and they'd like to know more about the subject, maybe have some advice. But I get emails from students all over the world, really, so not necessarily from students in the UK or in the US.
Yeah, and Orlando, do you see any difference?
I get emails from all everywhere. I get about, I don't know, normally I get about 2 or 3 per program, I get speak pipes too, because I have a speak pipe. I used to have a telephone number. I took it out because nobody called.
Are you seeing that more from, I mean, they're Spanish speaking, but are you seeing it more from people inside the U.S. or outside? I mean, or do you notice a difference?
No. It spreads out more or less the same way my listenership spreads out. There's some from the United States, mainly from Latino communities. Then there's a lot from Colombia, from Brazil. I have listeners in Japan, believe it or not. I have listeners in Israel. I have listeners in Italy.
Well, that's the key. I mean, I think if anyone has good stats, you can see where people are coming from, and it's almost becomes one of those. I feel like I'm driving by the RV down the interstate where it's got all the color-coded swatches for all the states they've hit in their travels. But so you look at the map in Libsyn or wherever, and you're like, oh, I've been listened to in every country except two weird countries. Like, yeah, that's the beauty of our medium, is like anyone in theory can get our content. And that actually reminds me of something and Addie says in the chat, something I want to talk about. She says another thing to keep in mind when podcasting for an international audience is the audio file size. She experienced it firsthand when she was in Spain this summer. She wasn't able to hear / download some of her favorite shows because the file size was too big for such weak bandwidth. It just took too long. You guys think about file size and bandwidth when you're producing your episodes? And Orlando, for you, do you get feedback since you have such a large listenership, in countries that in theory have...
No, if you mean complaints about the size of my files, no.
Well, what do you produce? Do you think about that when you make your files?
Yes. All my files
That's
are mono. The first thing is that they're mono. They're 80 megahertz. Or megahertz, is it? The
kilobits?
Kilobits. 80 kilobits, and they're mono. And normally a file of mine is about, 50 megs. 40 megs, 50 megs, more or less.
Even that is almost approaching big, I would think at this point. I mean,
well,
Dave,
but my shows are almost 2 hours long.
And that's
generally,
And that's part of the key is, do we consider, when you're making those decisions, like, okay, we're running 2 hours, we know the file size is going to be huge. For me, I will change my bit rate based on the length of my show. So if I had a 5-minute show, it may go out at 128 kilobits per second, as opposed to if I have an hour and a half show, it may go out 64. Because I have this sort of artificial limit in my head, which is about 50 megabytes, about where you're sitting, where I start to feel like this might be causing a problem for an audience who's outside and doesn't have good bandwidth or has a cap. I think you hear it a lot of times, like in Australia, there's a lot of caps in how much you can download. This is assuming you're not on Wi-Fi, I think. So,
I've been talking to lots of people from Latin America in these past 2 weeks because I actually interviewed several of my listeners for the program. Instead of interviewing experts, I've actually interviewed some of my listeners so that they'll tell me what the experience is like to listen to me from Argentina or from wherever they listen to me. And what I discovered was that in terms of bandwidth, they're not that bad. Really, the problems that they have in Latin America are problems with PayPal, for example, with Amazon. And that answered my question why I put things on my site and they don't sell, because they can't buy them. That there's restrictions in many of these countries that don't let them buy anything online.
Yeah.
So you have to monetize your podcast some other way because you can't sell anything.
Yeah, we'll talk about that because it's interesting because we talk, you do Amazon affiliates and stuff like that. Well, even in the U.S. that has some problems there. But Robert, do you consider file size when you're producing your episodes?
No, I tend not to really worry about it too much, but my episodes are usually quite small. They're like 15, 20 minutes long, so, and they're mono too, so I don't run into too many problems.
Yeah. And, in terms of mono, I do joint stereo, which is like, I think both of both worlds. So it can still be stereo and you can keep the file size down. That's a tech thing. But so if people are listening, they think, I have to do mono to get the lower file size. Not necessarily, but we won't dive into too much nerdery. I mean, Alan, do you consider file size when you're producing your show?
To a degree, but I do them at 128 joint stereo.
Mm-hmm. And how long are your episodes typically?
My shows average about a half hour, so it's not a big deal for me.
Right, you're about a 1-to-1 ratio there. Yeah, 30 is not bad. And I think really it applies more for longer format shows, upwards of half hour.
I have a question.
We have answers.
Why would you do a show in stereo if there's only one of you speaking? In my
Because
case,
of the
for
music.
example, it's just me. So why would I want to do it stereo?
Only because of the music.
Right.
Well,
And
yeah, but
yeah.
that's just the bumpers at the beginning and the end, and nobody. I don't think people really notice if it's stereo or it isn't.
That's the beauty of podcast production is you get to make those choices. And I think, and I mentioned joint stereo, which I think is the best of both worlds, which gives you the sort of benefits of mono file size with a sort of a fake stereo sound. So I think if you want, and Alan, I think you mentioned you do joint stereo. So
Yes.
again, we'll save it for a conversation on post production or something. But just in terms of keeping that file size smaller, Daniel, Dave, you guys both have. Well, Daniel, I don't know if your show is as long as it used to be. Dave, yours has come and gone between an hour and a half hour. Are these things as podcast producers? I know you guys have to think about this.
Yeah, I usually try to go 64. If I'm doing something where I'm talking about gear and I'm comparing something sounding to something else, then I'll definitely go 128 stereo. But I usually go 64 mono just because it's, again, I know somebody somewhere is going, that stupid idiot made it in stereo and it's going to take forever to download. And for most of the stuff I do, the music isn't that important to where, if it's not in stereo, it still sounds okay. And plus my music lasts about 5 to 6 seconds. So people can handle Bernie in mono.
I do everything of mine in mono, 64 kilobits per second, 16-bit. And 44.1 kilohertz. So just there's that whole spec for you. So you're wondering. And for the Audacity to podcast, it's as long as it needs to be. For my Once Upon a Time podcast, that's also as long as it needs to be, but it ends up being a lot longer. We've had episodes as long as 2.5 hours that we've published. And the file size is not only a concern for me and how quickly can I upload this and how quickly can people download it, but data caps, mobile bandwidth, storage on devices, especially for international audiences too, realizing that whatever I'm used to in the US could be completely different for someone else. So that's why, even though we play sound clips, it's all fine in mono, because what's most important is people to hear what we're saying and hear it clearly.
Yeah, I mean, even in parts of the U.S., I know Elsie Escobar for a while lived in a part of North Carolina that was up in the mountains, and she was having all sorts of problems getting any kind of reliable internet where she was living. So you don't have to be in a,
Yeah, there's still plenty of parts of the U.S. that don't have, good internet, whether that's a connection or, a lot of people, I mean, stuff's expensive, right? I mean, I'm on Wi-Fi all day, so it's not a problem. But the number one way to still receive a podcast, I don't know if that's the best way to say it, is people download them. I hit press play I stream it. I actively, progressively download it. Again, we won't open that Pandora's box, but that's how I do it because I'm on Wi-Fi all day. And I think as producers, we have to be careful not to overlay our own practices, how we consume, onto our own productions. We have to think, hey, it doesn't mean everyone's going to consume it this way, right?
I'll just add one more thing about what we're talking about here regarding stereo. Some of the interviewees that I have, some of the guests that I've had are professional singers. Most of them are indies, independent, but one of them is on a record label. But in any case, I have used clips of their music with their permission and with the permission of the label. And that's another reason why I wanted to use stereo in these cases. It's not in all the episodes, but it's been, at least we've had a group from Colombia, a singer from Chile, and another singer from Spain. So it has happened at least 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, and for me, it's often a quality. You know what? When you're podcasting long enough, and when you deep dive into always listening for the hiss or the tiny details, sometimes I put it on mono because the size requires it, but I can hear subtle differences almost nobody's going to hear, although my audience might hear it, and it bugs the heck out of me. So 96 is my perfect world compromise. But this, again, is the beauty of producing. But there are things, your own show, you get to decide, but there are things we should probably consider. So I think we've kind of figured those out.
I am looking at my stats for a couple different shows, and I see something really interesting. I'm looking between the Audacity to Podcast for 1 month and our Once Upon a Time podcast for another month. Interestingly, United Kingdom, between both of these podcasts, almost the exact same number of downloads. But for the United States, the Once Upon a Time podcast has twice as many downloads. For Australia, the Audacity to Podcast has more downloads than the other podcast that's more popular. It's kind of interesting to see how two completely different podcasts have the exact same audience size in certain countries, but then in other countries like the United States or Canada especially, the audience numbers are drastically different.
Well, that's because one of them has to do with a TV show.
Yeah.
If they don't show it over there, they're not interested, I think.
Yeah, I must say that I've not heard of the show. I don't know if it's aired in the UK, so yeah, this must be it.
It definitely is. But then some of these other countries, like I see Kenya is high. It's in my top 10 for the Audacity to Podcast.
Well, sometimes when I look through the list of the countries where I get, the occasional downloader at sort of 1% of my audience, I wonder, are these people who are born and raised in these countries, or are they maybe British expats who, because I know when I live in different countries, I want to get a taste of home maybe, so I'll listen to more British podcasts than I would if I was living in the UK, because it's nice to hear a friendly voice or something. So, maybe it's expats who are tuning in. It's hard to know, I guess.
That's what I've always thought. For example, when I saw that there were people listening to me in Japan and in Israel, I thought they were Puerto Ricans that were living over there. Then I discovered that there weren't. That several of them actually wrote to me. They sent me emails. One of them is from Peru. The other one is from Spain, from Granada. Different places in Latin America, and they are in these remote places. In Italy, I got one just yesterday from a guy that lives in Italy, and he's from, I think he said Peru. If he's not, I hope he'll forgive me. But I think he said Peru, and he lives in Italy because he fell in love with a girl from Italy, and he moved over there. Now he lives in Italy.
What's the awareness of what is the conversation around podcasts? We talk in the U.S. 40% of Americans have listened to a podcast, whatever that number is. But outside of that, Robert, in the UK and Switzerland, where do people? Can you still say I have a podcast and people know what you're talking about? Is it
absolutely not?
Absolutely not.
I feel like no, but I think that the same as I hear you guys talking about the serial phenomenon in the last year or two, how it seems to have blown up even more. I occasionally hear people in the broadcast media in the UK referencing serial, and the explosion in podcasts. But I feel like the average person probably hasn't listened to too many podcasts, or if they've heard of them, they're not exactly sure what they are. I was speaking to a previous boss of mine, and I told him about my podcast because it's sort of work related, and I guess I wanted to impress him. So he's asking me about it, and he said, "Oh, so who do you do it for?" Like he assumed it would be like a BBC thing. And so then when I told him I was like, "Oh, it's just me," thinking he'd be all impressed because it's a one-man show, I do everything myself. And he was like, "Oh, okay." So I think it doesn't have that if it doesn't have that brand recognition, then people are just like, well, it's just a hobby. It's just a homemade thing maybe. And so, but I don't know if that's a whole lot different to how it is for people in the US.
Yeah, we get that a lot here. Until recently, and I think, we hear about the explosion of podcasts, but really all it is an explosion of coverage. Although I will say there is so many people getting into the space now. There is this sort of boom where it's like every media company seems to be starting at least a podcast, if not a network. It just really feels like that, right? But that's at least all the things they're writing about. So we are definitely hearing about it a lot more in the U.S., and that definitely helps the exposure to the word or even someone listening to a podcast. Orlando, how about you? What do people generally know what you're saying in Puerto Rico if you're saying, hey, I have a podcast?
No, if you ask in Puerto Rico, nobody's going to know what it is.
That's crazy.
But if you ask in Spain, many people do. I actually interviewed a doctor from Spain who made her doctorate degree in podcasting. She's from the University of Salamanca. And there's another person in Madrid that also made his thesis in podcasting, doctoral level. And I was looking in the States, and there are several also. In Latin America, not so much. It still has to grow a lot in Latin America. But in Spain, you would be surprised. There's a lot of people that know what a podcast is. They produce great podcasts over there.
Why do you think that is? What's going on in Spain that's different in any other?
Well, first of all, it's Europe. You know, Europe is it's not a third world country. You know, so they're in Europe. They are exposed to all these influences from Britain and from France and from Italy, and people just know what it is. And there's a lot of great podcasts over there, even though the theme, the subject matter, is what I meant, is quite different in Spain and in Latin America as opposed to the United States. But podcasts in Latin America are a lot more social, and social in terms of social issues, not social media. Social issues. The subject matter tends to, has to do with social issues. In Spain, the same thing. Believe it or not, there's hardly any talk radio in Spain. I didn't know that. I discovered that just a week ago. People, they listen to radio for music, but there's no talk shows like we have in the United States or like we have in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was one of the first countries in the world to have a radio station, and right now we have 127 for an island that's just 100 miles long. So there's a lot of radio stations here, but most of them are talking politics, and most of them are talking about the same subjects, you know.
Yeah.
So after a while, it becomes boring. You know, I don't listen to radio hardly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not having radio, that seems like a huge opportunity, and maybe that is part of, has something to do with it. So
no, but they have radios. They just don't listen to talk shows. In Spain, you put on.
That's what I mean. In Spain, not having a lot of talk radio is not out there.
You turn on a radio and all you hear is music. And I have a listener in Spain that calls himself Pod Taxi. And all he plays is podcasts on his taxi. So he's a one-man promotion for me.
Do we have anybody in Puerto Rico that are? I'm going to try to say this, in llamas? Are they on fire? Is there anybody?
Well, actually, we have John Lee Dumas. He lives here.
Well, I know, but I mean, is anybody taking that brand? Yeah.
Now? He moved?
Yes.
Okay, all right. We'll go down that road.
He lives in a place called Palmas del
I'm glad
Mar.
I don't know that, to be honest with you.
It's a resort. It's a resort in Puerto Rico that's very, very, very expensive.
Not surprised.
In Puerto Rico, I haven't heard anybody talking about on fire, even though I pick up very quickly when I hear people imitating him. I never
International phenomenon.
I never cared.
I just wasn't sure if there was like somebody that took take any big name, smart passive income or.
No, and
it's a good idea. Don't reinvent the wheel.
In my case, let me tell you, and I don't mean to offend with this, but I don't really care about John Lee Dumas because the world already has a John Lee Dumas.
Exactly.
I don't want to be another John Lee Dumas. I want to be me. People, I have hundreds of emails that people have sent me where they say that they listen to me because of what I add to the subject, not because of the news. I cover the same thing that you guys cover or that Leo Laporte covers, but they listen to me for my opinions because I've been doing this since I was 7 years old.
Entrepreneurs in Fuego. It's on Stitcher. Addy just linked us to it.
Really?
It's been done.
It's not from Puerto Rico. I don't think so.
I don't know.
I was just wondering.
It's funny. That's all.
I just wondered if anybody had taken that recipe and just said, "Well, nobody's going to know because they're not listening in English."
To be honest with you, there's something there to that idea. It's not like a lot of British shows weren't just redone here in America and were the biggest hits ever. Right, and no one knew. Hey, did you know that this was done 20 years ago in the UK?
American Idol.
A lot of shows are like that. Like
The Office.
Hey, if you're struggling for an idea, you might want to see what's already successful. And I won't say copy it, but bring it to your country. Do it differently. It's not a horrible idea. I don't think.
No, it's not.
Just don't rip it off. Don't.
But I don't know. I've had that philosophy all my life. I've never looked to other people to copy them, because the way I feel about it is that the world already has a John Lee Dumas. Why do they need another one?
Right. Preach on, brother.
I'm sorry, but that's and I love the guy. I listen to his show, but in fact, there's things about his show that I don't like, because all his shows are basically the same show with a different person. And
well, that's the key, right? So if you have a show that you want to do and someone's already doing it, but you're afraid to start that show, do it and do it differently and do the stuff you think are issues for that show, and someone else who likes that show will like yours because they also don't like those things. So there's lots to learn from listening to other shows. Yes. And take those things that you see as needs and spin them in your own show. You can enter the same niche is the beauty. So again, I think we probably could benefit from listening to podcasts outside of our own culture or country, whatever, and see what they're doing. I mean, and bring it to our show, the parts you like, because again, it may be something that your audience is not used to, but it might work really well. I'm curious, Dave, Daniel, or anyone else, or Dave and Daniel specifically, do you listen to any shows that are not U.S. based that you know of?
I do. I listen to Membership Guys, which is from a Brit. Seems like there are one or two others. I have to look at my list.
I'm looking at my
listen
list right
to,
now.
and because it drives me nuts, because he interrupts his podcast all the time.
With what? Do you like audio clips?
The name of his show. He's a real famous blogger. And in the middle of it, Darren Rouse. What is that?
The pro blogger.
Pro blogger, yeah. In the middle of his show, like every 10 seconds, problogger.com. I'm like, okay, I got it the first time.
Not the radio.
Yeah.
Well, believe it or not, I picked that up from him. I do that about 3 times a show.
I listen to Show Me Your Mic. It's Chris Inns. He's a Canadian, so really it's the same thing. It doesn't count.
Podcraft from Colin Gray.
Right.
Or well, no, it's someone else is filling in for this season, but that's an international one.
Do you guys listen to somebody who's not a podcaster?
How could we?
Yeah, that's possible.
Well, it's possible. I listen to Larry King, for example.
So technically he is a podcaster only because someone's throwing his show in a feed. But yes, you're right. He is not.
I have his book, for example. I love the way he thinks, and I learned lots of things from him. One of the things I learned is, for example, if I'm going to interview one of you guys, I might write 20 questions and end up asking you 5, because if you take the conversation in a different direction, I'm going to go where you go. Because you're the interviewee. I want to listen to what you have to say. People don't want to listen to me. They know what I probably am going to say. So I go where the interview takes me. And sometimes that means asking half the questions, and the other half I just make them up as I go, depending on what the interview person says.
Yeah, I produce at work. We produce a show that actually is in Spanish, and believe it or not, I do some of the editing on that. But I don't. The good part is the person who produces it is actually he's in Puerto Rico as well. But we're seeing, I think there's huge opportunity in Latin America. I'm seeing a lot of Spanish-speaking podcasts seem to do quite well. So, I mean, even if you're based here in the U.S., I think and you speak Spanish, which we heard the stat of how many people that is, I think there's a lot of opportunity to go international. I mean, even if what about producing for an international audience? If you're thinking about getting in a niche that's impacted technology or something, but what if you speak another language and you specifically cater to another country, right? Maybe you speak German and podcasting isn't big, or is it going to be really hard? It's either going to be really hard to reach the audience because they either not be very aware of podcasting, or it's going to be easy to be at the top. I'm curious, which one of those would you rather have?
If I could do a podcast in another language, I'd do it in Chinese. There's 1 billion of them.
Yeah, but they can't get the show. It's all blocked. It's great, but you got to get past the great Chinese firewall. And obviously,
you say that, Ray, but I think my 5% of my audience is in China. So
that's it. That was my joke. I'm making a broad stroke stereotype. Maybe that's not true.
They're getting it.
Yeah. And what about? You got India, right? It's not massive population. with actual, I mean, like, and just an economy that, from what I know, is exploding. There should be a lot of opportunity there, but I don't even see it in my top 10 here.
And India's in English because India was a colony of Britain. So most of the people from India, they speak English.
Yeah. So
well, they know what Fortnite is over there. I can tell you from experience. But you make the point there about trying to market your podcast to a different audience. It makes me think of all these commercials I hear on monetized podcasts that are aimed almost entirely at an American audience, and it's for products that I can't buy here in Switzerland, I can't buy in the UK, and I hear it for these same companies over and over. I go, okay, yeah, let's hear this commercial again, and there doesn't seem to be an effort to really target your commercials to a wider audience. I don't know if that's even possible, right? If you just put an MP3 in a RSS feed and everyone gets the same thing, I don't even know if we can.
Yeah, and I think that's, there's probably part of the debate around that stuff today involves, dynamic ad insertion where you can actually have it, even within the U.S., where you could pick by state or county or something, right?
Let me give you a couple of numbers if you're interested. There's 427 million people in the world that speak Spanish. There's only 339 that speak English. So there's a huge opportunity out there. And this morning I was looking at my stats, and you know what I discovered? I discovered that I have more listeners with Android than I have with iPhones.
And that can be something too when you're talking about an international audience. I mean, Android is in part big because a lot of companies give that away. They'll just give you an Android, right? Whereas Apple wants to charge you a ton of money. But it's also, I don't know, you tend to see more Androids abroad for whatever reason. I mean, I was blown away. I went to Peru recently for some video work, and I mean, I got on WhatsApp because everybody knows WhatsApp doesn't feel as big in the U.S. as it feels, and because people could use it for free, and everybody used WhatsApp in Latin America. It seemed like, at least where I was. So
in Europe too.
Different experience for sure.
In Europe, everyone uses WhatsApp also.
Yeah.
And some people just can't buy Apple products, though. What I was telling you at the beginning of the program, that they have problems with PayPal and they have problems with Amazon. They also have problems with Apple because, for example, you can't buy an iPhone in Argentina.
Right. So this is a big issue that, as a producer, we have to consider, right? I mean, we heard some recent stats, Daniel, on internationalpodcastday.com. You guys should check that out. We heard stats about the sort of really poor job people are doing in marketing their show to Android listeners, right?
Well, yeah, it was something like only 9% of podcasters in their podcast audio. This is from Todd Cochran from Blueberry. Only 9% of podcasters in their episodes explain how to or point to how people can subscribe to the podcast through an Android device. Most podcasters who are asking for subscriptions are pointing to iTunes or the Apple Podcast app and not really thinking about the Android users.
That's true.
Right, and there's a couple solutions for that. I mean, Todd himself, they have subscribeonandroid.com. I mean, just what you put on your website,
I use
right?
that.
Right. And
I use their service of subscribe on Android. My show is in Google Play Music, but I don't promote it because it's not usable yet outside of the US and Canada.
Yeah.
So I tell people when I'm off the air, but I don't promote it on the show or on the website because it would be confusing since most of my listeners won't be able to consume it that way. I hope that changes soon. I know that Google has their many projects going on at once, but I hope they make that worldwide.
Yeah, I think,
because it would make things easier for us.
I think one of the keys, though, on your website is to not assume any way of consumption and to make it available to everyone. So if it's just a matter of chiclets, or the little clickable tabs, to have that option. I retweeted Dave Weiner the other day, and he said, if you're a podcaster, make it very easy for people to find your RSS feed on your website. And these are simple things to do.
I have subscribe on Android, but you can understand how it's confusing if you put a link to Google Play Music and it doesn't work for 80% of your audience. That's the reason why I haven't put that chicklet on there. But I have the other ones.
I think that someone who is coming to your show who uses, who would use it or be in the ecosystem they would click it. Otherwise, I don't know why you would really click it. You would see the iTunes one and you would click that. I think you click with what you.
I'm talking about the Android people that are outside of the U.S. and Canada. Talking about those people. Sure. And I have friends who are outside of the country, and I have them check once in a while to see if it's working yet. And it's still not working.
Yeah. And, that's one of those issues that time will solve, unfortunately. And what do you guys, as far as subscription and promotion of subscription and thinking about who's listening, what do you guys do? Where, Orlando, where do you tell people to subscribe, or do you even tell people to do that?
Well, absolutely, I do. I have my show on iTunes. I have it on subscribe on Android.
But what do you promote?
I promote most of them because I tell them in every show that all the buttons are on my website. And believe it or not, one of the places I get the most people from is a place called iVox Media that's very hot in America Latina and in Spain. I don't really know too many people that listen to iVox Media in the States. I don't know if they even do. But
they're based in Catalonia, Spain, and my show is listed on their site also. So I'm familiar with it.
I get a lot of traffic. Great. Yeah, I get a lot of traffic from them. I get a lot of traffic from Stitcher, from TuneIn. I am not on Google Play. I never registered. I don't want to be there. So I can't really tell you about them.
Why don't you want to be there?
Well, for two simple reasons. First, they reprocess your audio file, and second, there's something in their user agreement that says that they can remove content from your file, and I'm not going to allow anybody to tinker with my file. So I never applied. I don't want it. And in hindsight, what I'm seeing is that most people, they're not getting hardly anything from Google Play.
No, not yet.
So
not yet. By the way, Stitcher does reprocess it. Is it also?
Not anymore. No,
not anymore.
Not anymore.
Well, let's be careful. Let's be careful.
I got
I stand corrected. I didn't know.
I got an email from them.
It's a new change.
2 weeks ago. 1 week.
Thank you. I stand corrected.
Now they're feeding off your feed. So now if you're on Libsyn, they're feeding from Libsyn, wherever you are.
Good to know.
So as we head out, final thoughts and recommendations for, as podcasters, we are speaking to a global audience, right? Is there anything that you think we should consider when we're doing that, when we're on our shows? Anything we could do different, we can improve? Final thoughts, whatever you got. But let us know where we can find your internationally searchable show. Hopefully, I would think that's your website, but tell us where we can find your podcast and any closing thoughts. And thank you so much for being here. Alan, I'm glad that your internet mostly held up. So thanks for joining us for your first roundtable.
Thank you very much. You can hear or you can find my show at capicuafm.com. And I'm standing up a little bit so you can see the letters on the screen here, CAPICUAFM.com. And the only thing that I would like to add is for international podcasters and content producers in general who need to get a domain with an accent mark or other diacritical character in their domain name, which is what I do have for Capicua FM. I always recommend getting it both with and without because probably 90% of the people won't bother entering it in, so have one mirror the other. And if you are going to use an SSL certificate on your website, which I've been doing since 2014, since a Google recommendation for SEO, in addition for all of the other reasons, for all of my websites that do not deal with iTunes and do not have an accent mark, I use the free Let's Encrypt SSL certificate. But for the ones that are either with an accent mark or involved with iTunes, then it has to be a paid one because iTunes doesn't like the Let's Encrypt one so far. So that's my only addition. If there are any questions about that, go ahead and ask me. But that's basically the summary.
Very cool. All right. Well, let's get to the guest, and then we'll jump out here, the co-host. And Orlando, thank you so much for joining us for your first roundtable.
It was my pleasure. I produced the Hablando de Tecnología podcast. I'm not going to spell it because the people that speak Spanish know how it's written. The ones that don't aren't going to listen anyway because they don't.
I'm going to listen to it now.
So
He
it's
knows his audience.
hablandodetecnologia.com, and I do have my domain both with an accent and without the accent.
Congratulations.
I've had it for a long time. And as far as growing your show, because we didn't really talk about that, I've done two things and two things only. I ask my listeners on every show to tell 2 friends. And the other thing I do is I started making my list from day one. That's it.
Yeah, that's, I asked recently because why did I ask? It was something to do with the last roundtable, but I asked about that on Twitter. I said, if you have one call to action, that was what we did.
Just think about it.
And a lot of people said tell a friend.
If everybody told 2 people, it'll grow exponentially.
The key is they need to tell 2 people who are interested in the content. So hopefully their friends are like them, because the key is, a lot of people listen to podcasts because their friends don't want to have that conversation with them. Like, stop talking to me about microphones, dude. I don't care. You're like, oh, well, I've got this whole community of people who do care. I'm out of here. But yes, if you can find 2 friends who would love the content, definitely. That is the single best way, I think, to get more listeners. So thanks, Orlando. Robert, thanks for joining us for your first roundtable. All first-time roundtablers. Very cool.
Thanks a lot, Ray. It's been great to be here, and thanks everyone for an interesting conversation. You can find me at robertburriss.com. My podcast is the Psychology of Attractiveness podcast. I would say that one of the biggest hurdles, like I said before, when I started doing my podcast was thinking, people like me in the UK tend not to have radio shows. I haven't got a voice for radio, but most of your audience is probably going to be international if you're not based in the US. And most people around the world who are going to be listening to podcasts in English are going to be more familiar with American English. And, maybe they're going to want to hear a voice that's different. So I say, just get involved.
Yeah, great advice. And Daniel, as we head out here, thanks for helping us today, as always.
Something I recommend you think about is any unit of measurement. Convert it to something that's international. If that's inches, miles, speed, kilometers, anything like that, convert it to be international. Because if someone says to me, oh yeah, it's 50 centimeters wide, I don't know yet how wide that is. I'm trying to adapt to the metric system, but also think about time zones. If you tell people 5 p.m. Eastern time, what's the GMT or the UTC offset, which does unfortunately change with daylight saving time. I hate that. But I just know this now because I tell it in all of my podcasts. When I'm live, I say it's Eastern Daylight Time, GMT -4, or if it's Standard Time, it's Eastern Standard Time, GMT -5. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitypodcast.com.
Mark, I don't get a check from Nike, so let me just do this. There we go. Nike, well, you want that back, you can hit up the podcastersroundtable.com. Gmail, something like that. Hey, I'm wearing a Nike hat, if that's what's going on, audio-only people. That's a good point. If you are signed up at podcastersroundtable.com/guest, you'll be on the email list, and you can submit to us. I haven't forgot about you, Dave, and let us know why you want to be on the roundtable, but you will see in those emails that it gives you the GMT -7 in this case, currently when you're hearing this. So I definitely try to abide with that. And it's a good tip. Make your podcast more international friendly when it comes to those things. I think it really does. It really can help, and it's considerate, but maybe it depends on your niche as well, so we can discuss offline. But Dave, thanks so much again for helping, as always.
Yeah, Dave Jackson from the School of Podcasting.com, and there are 2 things. Number one, I kind of going what Robert was saying, if you think your accent is going to hold people back, I have no problem listening to people with accents. The only one I ever have a problem is I have somebody with a really, really, really super strong Irish brogue that I really have to strain to listen to. But the good news is he probably is just knocking it out of the park in his country. The other thing, the coolest thing I've heard tonight was when Robert said that people have no clue in Switzerland about podcasting. And I was like, because that just means there's more fresh meat on the way. That's cool. So when I hear that, there's nobody knows, I'm like, cool, there's an audience that in 5 years is going to be like, podcasting is blowing up in Switzerland. So That's going to be awesome.
So I'm gonna hear a lot of Swiss references in your upcoming shows. That's what I'm hearing.
You're talking a lot of cheese.
I know. Careful, we're gonna get very stereotypical here. I don't imagine your Swiss knowledge is very deep. But let's try not to offend as we head out here. But. All right, Podcasters Roundtable 80 is next. Hopefully, we'll see you. So sign up, and we will be back fortnightly. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Am I right with that? Does that mean?
Yeah.
All right.
That's what it means.
I better check up on that. All right. We will see you next time. Wave goodbye. We're out of here.